This hour on I-24 News, the British government has expelled 23 Russian diplomats. The action from Theresa May follows Moscow's refusal to explain the alleged Russian poisoning of a double agent and his daughter on British soil.
Plus, controversial details are emerging about President Trump's new pick to run the CIA and about her dark past running the agency's torture program.
And across the United States, exactly a month after the mass shootings in Florida, hundreds of thousands of students walked out of their classrooms and demonstrated against gun violence.
From the I-24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Tal Heinrich.
The tensions keep growing between the governments of Great Britain and Russia. British Prime Minister Theresa May has announced that she is expelling 23 Russian diplomats. This follows Moscow's refusal to explain the poisoning of a former double agent on British soil.
Theresa May said the diplomats have 1 week to leave the country. She described them as undeclared intelligence officers. May also revoked an invitation to Russia's foreign minister and said the royal family would not attend the FIFA World Cup later this year. International Affairs correspondent Bianca Zanini has more.
Under the Vienna Convention, the United Kingdom will now expel 23 Russian diplomats who have been identified as undeclared intelligence officers. They have just 1 week to leave.
The already tense relationship between Moscow and London was pushed further to the edge when UK Prime Minister Theresa May today announced her official response to the poisoning of a former Russian double agent in Salisbury, the biggest expulsion of Russian diplomats in more than 3 decades. The cancellation of all high-level meetings, freezing Russian assets deemed potential threats, and even a downgrade in the UK's attendance at the World Cup in Russia this summer.
There is no alternative conclusion other than that the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal and his daughter, and for threatening the lives of other British citizens in Salisbury, including Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey.
38 people in Salisbury were attended by medics after the poisoning. Mr. Skripal, his daughter, and a police officer still remain in hospital. The decision to fundamentally degrade Russian intelligence capabilities in Britain comes after Moscow, which denies any and all accusations, chose not to comply with the deadline, essentially requiring them to explain how the Soviet-made nerve agent ended up poisoning the former agent on British soil. And Britain is not alone.
Irrespective of Brexit and the tough negotiations, I would like to express my full solidarity with Prime Minister Theresa May in the face of the brutal attack, which was inspired most likely by Moscow. I am ready to put this issue on the agenda of next week's EU summit.
Moscow is warning London not to push the issue or use language of ultimatums, making it clear that any moves from the UK will not go unanswered.
For our British colleagues and those who support them, even without knowing yet the results of an investigation that is not over, it is no longer the confession that is the queen of evidence, but mere suspicion.
What started as the beginning of a spy novel is now on the verge of becoming a full-blown international crisis. Bianca Zanini, I-24 News.
Joining us now from London is our I-24 News UK and European correspondent Jonathan Sarchidoti. And Jonathan, Russia, as we heard in the piece, did not meet a deadline to cooperate in the case. What's been the reaction in the UK to that and to Prime Minister May's announcement?
Theresa May's announcement has been really very well received all round. It's been the case that most people within the House of Commons on either side of the divide, Labour and Conservatives, supported her. Only Jeremy Corbyn spoke out saying that maybe we should be giving Russia the benefit of the doubt still and questioning whether there was sufficient evidence to absolutely say the Russian state was behind this attack. But otherwise, it's been pretty much well received. Her actions seem to be fitting for what's happened. People are just saying they hope that she carries through on what she said she'll do rather than just talking the talk.
What is the UK hoping to achieve by imposing these measures? What is May basically telling Putin by announcing the steps?
Theresa May is trying to send a very clear signal that Britain won't put up with this, and not only that Britain won't put up with this sort of activity, but that the whole world won't put up with it. That's why she's taken her case to NATO and she's taken her case to the UN, because she's relying on international support for Britain's position. And we did see Nikki Haley speaking out very forcefully in the UN Security Council earlier, saying that she did believe that Russia was behind this. And let's not forget that what Theresa May has described this as is no less than an illegal use of force within the UK, using military-grade chemical weapons on British citizens within the United Kingdom. As Nikki Haley said, that is one member of the United Nations Security Council attacking another on their own ground using chemical weapons.
Jonathan, where does the overall investigation stand, and what's the condition right now of Sergei Skripal and his daughter?
The Skripals are believed to still be in a critical condition, not talking, though very little is being said about their health situation. In the meantime, the policeman, as we know, did recover somewhat, and he's been able to help a little bit by telling others what he does know in the investigation. The investigation's ongoing, and it's spreading out. More sites are being cordoned off, more vehicles being removed, decontaminated, possibly even destroyed, with some working theories that perhaps the nerve agent was administered on the door handle of the Skripal's car. But the fact that the rumors about what the current state of the investigation is changes all the time, with different working theories leaking out and then being undermined by other working theories, either shows that the authorities are keeping this very secret, as they wish to, or that they're not quite sure what's happening themselves, and these theories are all being tested thoroughly by everybody involved.
I-24 News UK and European correspondent Jonathan Sarchidoti. Jonathan, thank you.
British officials have already met with NATO members and the UN Security Council over this case.
And Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, said the world needs to send Russia a message.
This is a defining moment. Time and time again, member states say they oppose the use of chemical weapons under any circumstance. Now one member stands accused of using chemical weapons on the sovereign soil of another member. The credibility of this council will not survive if we fail to hold Russia accountable.
For more, let's bring in our senior diplomatic correspondent, Nina Larsen. She joins us in studio. Nina, you know London very well. Prime Minister May is talking now about possibly freezing Russian assets. What kind of impact would that have?
This would have a tremendous impact. There's an awful lot of Russian money in central London, in areas like Knightsbridge, for example. The Russians have a lot of money in there, so this will really hit a lot of the elite in central London.
Nina, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said more than once that in the U.S. we have what he calls Russophobia, and now we're seeing the anti-sentiment, the anti-Russian sentiment reaching the U.K. How is Theresa May hoping to take it to the world?
Well, I think we've seen today she's been extremely tough, and she's been accused of not being tough enough in the past in her rhetoric and her actions. And I think it speaks volumes that the UN Security Council met so quickly about this. It shows you the kind of leverage that United Kingdom has, and obviously they can count on their allies on the Council, the United States and France and other Western powers on the rotating Council. But as for the past of the permanent members go, Russia is becoming increasingly isolated, and I think what Nikki Haley was talking about there is not just this incident, it's the consistent vetoes by Russia on pressing international problems like Syria, like Yemen, and this is just another example.
What do you make of the Russian dismissal of all this? The claims that, oh, if the UK was really concerned, they should have gone through a 10-day protocol and given Russia an opportunity to respond. Instead, all of this is premature, according to Moscow.
I think, again, Russia is just playing for time, like they usually do. This is a typical technique, and we're just seeing the same narrative again and again.
All right, Nina Larsen, our senior diplomatic correspondent. Nina, thank you very much. The tensions between Great Britain and Russia could put President Trump in an awkward spot.
Initially, the president was slow to point the finger at Russia, but during his time in California, President Trump spoke on the phone with Theresa May and admitted that Russia was to blame and agreed that Moscow should face some consequences.
Let's bring in our I-24 News anchor and correspondent Janice Dillon, who joins us now live from Capitol Hill. And Shana, the president, has he gone as far in his condemnation of Russia as we saw that Nikki Haley has?
Well, not just Nikki Haley, by the way. It was also Secretary of State Rex Tillerson who had one of the strongest condemnations for Russia right before he was ousted. And some believe he was fired because his response made the White House's look weak. And the truth is we haven't really heard the president go as far as Nikki Haley. But that's generally a pattern with the president. He allows his top advisors like Haley to criticize Russia while he himself is either slow to or won't do it at all.
Shayna, if the president decides to really back up Theresa May and chooses to act, what would it look like?
Yeah, the U.S. could help the U.K. in their investigation. They could try and help them prevent future attacks, maybe help craft or support new sanctions. But remember, Congress here in the United States already overwhelmingly voted for sanctions to punish Russia for meddling in the 2016 elections. And those sanctions, by the way, the president still refuses to impose.
Shayna, the White House and Downing Street both released readouts of Tuesday's phone call between President Trump and British Prime Minister Theresa May, but they looked a bit different. Can you explain?
Yeah, the readout from the White House was a statement in the president's name, said he wanted answers from Russia, how a nerve agent developed in Russia ended up being used in this attack in the UK, and that whoever did this should be punished. But again, not specifically pointing the finger at Russia, even though Theresa May has said Russia, it's highly likely that Russia was behind this. Theresa May, the statement from her office says that the U.S. promised to be with the UK all the way on this. We'll have to see if some actions follow up on that statement.
Shayna Dillon reporting this evening from Washington, D.C. Shayna, thank you. Tal, what do you make of all this?
I think that all the sides involved are really acted as we could have expected. But what's your stance on what Donald Trump is, the way the president is reacting?
I think the president was caught by surprise, perhaps, by how quickly and how aggressively British Prime Minister Theresa May responded, maybe underestimated the outrage in British territories about this. And I think it does put him, again, in a tough spot because, as Shayna pointed out, there are these sanctions that Congress has passed. The administration has refused to implement them. And now the questions, again, keep coming.
And suddenly when the UK is acting against Russia, from here, from a distance, it looks very, very fierce.
Yeah, it looks fierce and it looks like they're tougher on the Russians.
Exactly, that's what I was
thinking. They have less fear than the United States and the Trump administration has. And it makes a lot of people wonder, well,
yeah.
Well, after a shakeup at the top of the U.S. State Department, the Trump administration is looking to quickly confirm Mike Pompeo as the new Secretary of State, but lawmakers in both parties now say it will not be easy.
Plus, the confirmation problems may be growing for Gina Haspel, the president's nominee to run the CIA. Her association with CIA black sites and waterboarding is sparking outrage. Welcome back to Crossroads. Lawmakers say they hope to hold confirmation hearings for Secretary of State nominee Mike Pompeo as early as April.
Pompeo is currently the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. President Trump asked him to become Secretary of State after the firing of Rex Tillerson. Pompeo is known for his hawkish foreign policy views and for his fierce defense of President Trump.
Trump's pick to take over for Pompeo at the CIA will be veteran CIA officer Gina Haspel.
Haspel has been with the agency for over 30 years. She helped oversee a CIA torture program in the months after 9/11. Senior defense correspondent Shai Ben-Ari has more on her controversial past.
The appointment of Gina Haspel to be the next CIA director has sent shockwaves through Washington and other world capitals for different reasons. The current deputy director, Haspel, is expected to become the first female CIA chief in history. She is an award-winning career intelligence officer, highly respected within the organization. But she also has a highly controversial past. Haspel has been linked to the use of torture under the Bush administration against suspected al-Qaeda terrorists.
She ran a black site at Thailand where there were brutal interrogations of some detainees. When she got back to Washington, she played various leadership roles in the components of the CIA that were involved in those operations.
During the period she ran the site, Abu Zubaydah, a suspected terrorist, was waterboarded 83 times in a single month. Other torture methods included physical abuse, sleep deprivation, and being kept in a box. Haspel's former CIA boss, Jose Rodriguez, wrote in his book that she even gave orders to shred videotape evidence of such interrogations.
This was a deliberate decision to destroy evidence and may very well have been evidence of a crime scene.
Her past could complicate her Senate confirmation process, with top Democrats promising to ask plenty of questions. Republican John McCain, himself a victim of torture, said Haspel needed to explain the extent and nature of her involvement. In Israel, reactions were different. Despite the controversy, 2 recently retired senior Israeli defense officials who spoke to I-24 News expressed major satisfaction at Haspel's appointment, noting her professional reputation and the fact that she was promoted from within CIA. One of them added the choice indicated the U.S. had moved closer to the Israeli viewpoint in relation to terror and the means needed to fight it. Extreme interrogation techniques have been used extensively in Israel for years in fighting terrorism. Shai Ben-Ari, I-24 News.
Several U.S. lawmakers, including Senator John McCain, as we just heard, have already come out against Haspel's nomination, and they say it's because of her record on torture.
Senator Rand Paul also said he's against Haspel running the CIA and pointed to a disturbing report from her past.
I am troubled by her participation in the Black Ops site in Thailand. Particularly troubling, I think, is this quote from her time there and from the time when the torture was actually occurring. The quote from one of the interrogators says that Gina Haspel said, "Good job. I like the way you're drooling." When you read that, sort of the joyful glee at someone who's being tortured, I find it just amazing that anyone would consider having this woman at the head of the CIA.
To discuss, let's bring in Lieutenant Colonel Hale Kemper, CEO and founder of Knowledge and Intelligence Program Professionals. Hale, you know, how problematic is it that someone who's been directly involved in such torture programs will become the head of the CIA? Do you agree with McCain, with Rand Paul?
Well, you know, there was a lot of CIA officers that were involved with that program. It was right after 9/11. I can tell you that at one time that even passed by me that they were going to have me go overseas to work at a site where things like enhanced interrogation techniques were being done. I didn't actually take that assignment, but it was the tenor of the times. I think it's going to be a very controversial confirmation process, but she is a highly qualified candidate. In fact, one of the best qualified candidates for that job that I've seen in a very long time.
But to your point about the number of CIA people who were involved in this, is it worth reopening all these old wounds over enhanced interrogation or torture, as people describe it, by having her have to go through a confirmation hearing when there's so many other people, both at the CIA and elsewhere, who were not involved as directly in these kind of techniques?
I'd like to think that was carefully weighed in the decision to bring her, to nominate her. But what I will tell you is she was kind of uniquely positioned. It's kind of a bold move because she's the first woman CIA director in the history of that organization. She's held a number of senior posts. She really does know the job. She's got the confidence of a number of key lawmakers. And yes, she ran a black site in Thailand where there was enhanced interrogation techniques, and she also was involved with the destruction of the tapes involving some of the enhanced interrogations. Those are going to be talked about in the committee, but she really does know the job, and she'll be a very forceful and effective leader.
But if we do know that the CIA is using such torture techniques for interrogations, then it probably means that former CIA directors were also aware of this fact, and Gina Haspel is to blame just as much as them. Maybe. I want to ask you, how clean should someone be to be considered legitimate for such a role?
Tal, it's tough to say how anybody could be clean from that era because what was going on wasn't some deep secret that wasn't known in intelligence circles. I mean, it had to be known certainly throughout the entire chain of command of the CIA, but it was known up to the White House. There was actually some forceful, at the time, very forceful support of these enhanced interrogation techniques. So literally there's just a lot of people out there that knew this was going on, and she was under orders to do this. It was orders at the highest level, and you know, we can all say things in retrospect, but frankly, it'll be controversial, but it was just the tenor of the times. It was right after 9/11.
There's a former military interrogator, I believe it was with the CIA, Ali Soufan, who says that the only actionable intelligence he ever got from interrogation was when he was nice to a prisoner and introduced him to a McDonald's Filet-O-Fish. And he says that the idea of using enhanced interrogation techniques never produced any actionable intelligence. What's your experience with it?
Well, my experience is very direct. When they talk about things like waterboarding and getting locked in a box and things like that, I went through the training. Okay, I know what it is from the receiving end, and so I have a lot of direct experience there. But what I will tell you is what we call the soft sell techniques tend to work a lot better. And Secretary Jim Mattis, General Jim Mattis, my old boss, I used to be his director of intelligence. He was also a big proponent of soft sell techniques. You know, saying more you get with a pack of cigarettes and a kind word and a cup of coffee than you can ever get doing some of these techniques. So there is a lot of truth to that.
Huh. Lieutenant Col Hale Kemper, thank you for this.
Thank you, Tal.
So your thoughts on both these techniques or torture and the idea that maybe Gina Haspel's not the right person for the job?
It's a tough question. I think he somewhat convinced me that there was another time, a different time maybe, when she was there in Thailand. What do you think?
My sense is that her confirmation is going to depend on how she does when she's under questioning. If she stands up and says, we used enhanced interrogation techniques and I have no problems with that, if she's very defensive, I don't think she'll get confirmed. If she comes forward and says, look, I was just following orders, I didn't really get much actionable intelligence, we've learned things since then about the best way to get intelligence, then I think lawmakers will trust her and she'll get confirmed. But so much, I think, is going to depend on how she does in these actual hearings.
But is it in line with what Senator Rand Paul just read out?
I mean, Rand Paul's going to quiz her, I would imagine, during these hearings, and she's going to have some answers ready. So.
In Syria, this convoy of civilians has finally found safe passage out of the rebel-held areas of eastern Ghouta. Thousands of others were not so lucky.
Plus, Hamas is blasting claims by its longtime rival, the Palestinian Authority, that Hamas was behind a bombing attack that targeted the party's prime minister. Turkish forces have surrounded the Syrian town of Afrin and are preparing to advance further into the city center. Thousands of people have been displaced in the fighting between Turkey and local Kurdish fighters. The Kurds were armed and trained by the United States. Many civilians have managed to get out safely, but Turkey, which is another U.S. ally, has published several videos like this, which appears to show some civilians being blocked by Kurdish fighters.
The UN has said that local authorities were responsible for blocking some civilians, but did not directly implicate the Kurdish fighters. The Kurds have said they are in a fight for their lives against Turkey, which considers them to be terrorists.
Meantime, in eastern Ghouta, some civilians are finally finding a way out of that fighting. More than 146 people managed to get out yesterday. Many of them said they were afraid to evacuate until now because of fear of getting caught in the crossfire. The Palestinian group Hamas has denied that it was behind the assassination attempt against the leader of a rival Palestinian faction.
Hamas was initially blamed for the attack, but as senior Middle East correspondent Mohammed Al-Qasim explains, the truth remains a mystery.
Well, now that the dust has settled just 24 hours after the failed assassination attempt on the life of the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Rami al-Hamadallah and the chief intelligence of the Palestinian intelligence organization Majid Faraj, who was behind this attack? Until this hour, no one knows for sure, and no one has claimed responsibility for this failed assassination attempt. Hamas says it wasn't behind this attack, and many say it's highly unlikely it was the movement in charge of the Gaza Strip, because it exposes one of its weaknesses, that it cannot really assert its complete and full control over the security or internal security of the Gaza Strip. Others say it could have been Fatah or the Palestinian Authority to undermine Hamas's control. That's also highly unlikely, because if Fatah or the Palestinian Authority is exposed following this failed assassination attempt on two of its own members, this will put it in a very difficult situation. So who's left and who's going to benefit from it? It could be maybe one of those Salafist small fringe groups that have been giving lots of headaches to the Hamas movement inside the Gaza Strip, as they have been firing rockets onto Israel, and they were behind some of the unrest in the coastal enclave. That's one theory. Others say it could have been President Mahmoud Abbas's nemesis, Mohammed Dahlan, who's been fired by President Abbas from the Fatah movement. However, he has been in close contact with the Hamas movement in Egypt. He's been talking to them and trying to find ways to ease the economic hardship in the coastal enclave. So until now, even though the fingers are being pointing at each other between Fatah and Hamas, between Ramallah and Gaza, so far this is still a mystery that no one seems to have the answer to. Mohammed Al-Qasim, I-24 News, Ramallah, the West Bank.
All these clashes between Palestinian factions must drive people at the White House crazy as they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we put together this possible peace deal and peace plan to get the talks going again when they have no idea if the Palestinians will be unified in terms of who might even be representing them?
Exactly. It's supposed to be a peace plan for the two sides to negotiate. Who are the two sides? Israel is one side. Who is on the other side? The Palestinian Authority. You have Hamas. Now you have Mohammed Ahlan maybe as a rising power. Islamic Jihad might have been behind this attack. But you know what's the good thing? That he survived.
Yeah.
It could have been worse.
Yeah, it could have been a lot worse. This has been a fascinating day in the world of U.S. politics, particularly on the issue of gun violence. Thousands of students, high school students, all across the United States marched on this day. They left their classrooms and showed solidarity with the students in Parkland, Florida, and that mass shooting that happened exactly a month ago. We'll have all the details ahead.
Welcome back. The closely watched special election in Pennsylvania is reportedly still too close to call, but Democrat Connor Lamb has already declared victory.
Yeah, it's a congressional district that President Trump dominated in the 2016 presidential election by more than 20 points. So you can understand some of the Republican nervousness about what just happened. The Republicans are not yet ready to concede defeat. They are reportedly planning a series of legal maneuvers to set the stage for a recount. Correspondent Serena Marshall explains.
Close today. It's an open seat. Come on.
Republicans not ready to concede in the closely watched southwestern Pennsylvania race that pitted Democrat Connor Lamb against Republican Rick Saccone. And they argue the race isn't indicative of November.
I just don't think you're going to see that across the country.
Mr. Lamb was brilliant. He ran as a Republican. So it worked for him.
But simply an aberration and wake-up call moving into the midterms.
And I think that you can't deny that, and if you do, you're lying.
With almost all the votes officially in, Lamb leads by 627.
It took a little longer than we thought, but we did it. Mission accepted.
He didn't even wait last night for the area's smallest county to add up their absentee ballots before declaring victory. But Saccone told his own supporters,
"Don't give up, and we'll keep it up. We're going to win it."
Today, Saccone only netted 14 votes from those absentee ballots in the last county, putting the two candidates within 0.2 of a percentage point. Even if Saccone pulls out as the winner, there's no denying the 23-point swing from Republican to Democrat in a county the president won by double digits. And when compared to other special elections in Georgia, Montana, and Kansas, a trend. Democratic overperformance. The official results unlikely to come before the end of the week. And the National Republican Congressional Committee tells ABC News, we're absolutely not conceding. We're waiting on provisional ballots. We're not ruling out a recount or other further legal action.
And that was Serena Marshall reporting. Let's bring in our senior national correspondent, Michael Schur. And Shu, how big of a wake-up call is this race for Republicans and for President Trump about their message heading into the midterms?
Well, it's their message. It's also their president. It's the fact that you're competing in an area that was typically Democrat, a state that was typically Democratic, in an area that was a little to the right of that Democratic state. And they switched this by so many points. Whether or not Lamb wins or Saccone wins in a recount, this is still the same wake-up call for the Republicans. And you heard Paul Ryan say that it was an aberration, that this is a different thing, that Connor Lamb ran this way. The point is, all these races, the caveats that they all may carry with them, are all bad for the Republicans in some way, whether it's Alabama and Doug Jones or whether it's Connor Lamb here in Pennsylvania. Democrats also have to tailor their message in different places. But this is certainly something that the politicos have to pay attention to, because if this is happening in every little race that's happening across the country now, November is going to be a tough night. November 6th is going to be a tough night for the Republicans, David.
So, Michael, how can you explain this change in Pennsylvania, a district that Donald Trump won by 20 percentage points?
Well, I think here's what's interesting. I mean, Tal, people are going to talk about this for quite a while, try and figure it out. This is one of the areas where you can probably point to Hillary Clinton having been the nominee in Pennsylvania, because a lot of these, white industrial belt workers down in the southern counties of this district, that's Washington County, Greene County, as opposed to the ones in the northern part, a little more affluent Allegheny County, those are the types of voters who have been Union voters and Democratic voters who went for Trump last time. They came back to Lamb this time, who had a very different message than Donald Trump. Yes, he wasn't a progressive Democrat, but he certainly wasn't a Donald Trump Republican, even though he refused to excoriate the president on anything. As a Democrat, that's a very curious way to go, and it seems to have worked well for him. But I think that you look at this and you see different people at the top of the ballot in these races, and that could mean success for Democrats in places they didn't think they could get it.
Michael, are there particular themes that Conor Lamb promoted during this campaign that may be picked up by other Democrats? And I guess I'm thinking, for example, he distanced himself from Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader in the House, said that she has to go. He talked a lot about Medicare and protecting Social Security. Anything there that you see other Democrats jumping on?
Yeah, well, Shu, I don't know that he said she had to go. She shouldn't. He said that he wouldn't support her as Speaker. That's something that Democrats have latitude to say. Some have said it publicly on the floor of the House. Others have said it in campaigns. And I think Nancy Pelosi understands, look, when you're the Democratic Party, you're going to have Conor Lambs. The Republican Party is not going to have to cater to as many of their moderates. But the Democratic Party knows that they have to cater to these moderates to get their majority. And Nancy Pelosi doesn't care if somebody badmouths her on the campaign trail if it means the Democrats have the majority in the next Congress. She's either Speaker or decides not to be Speaker or stand for Speaker, but she knows that the chairmanships change, and she knows that the president no longer has an ally on the House of Representatives side. So I think what he did was he ran a smart race for his district, which was not to bring the president up. The president won by 20 points there, remember that, to talk about Nancy Pelosi, who isn't very popular, and to talk about, you know, unions and how important union members are. It worked well there. It's a simple message, but it's one that some are loath to take because of the risks involved in criticizing your own party and not criticizing the president.
And Michael, just briefly, after yesterday's visit to Los Angeles by the president, today he's in St. Louis. What is he doing there?
Well, he's causing traffic still in L.A., I can promise you that. Taking down barriers, and we're not prepared for this. I mean, he's taking a message on the road today to St. Louis and to Missouri, talking about what his accomplishments are, talking about tax reform. This is a message that he's trying to push forward and talking about bringing jobs back to the United States. That's what the president is trying to underscore, especially the night after his party took what appears like a loss, at least thus far, Tal.
Our senior national correspondent, Michael Shore, thank you and good luck driving home today.
Thanks, Tal.
And still to come here on Crossroads, nearly 200,000 students across the United States staged a walkout protesting against gun inaction. We'll have all the details.
But first, a look at the latest headlines from across the Middle East.
This is Eye on the Middle East with the stories from the region you likely didn't see in the news. Nearly half of the United States arms exports over the past 5 years have gone to the Middle East. According to a study by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Saudi Arabia secured its place as the world's second biggest global arms importer. The Middle East, engulfed in conflict for the past 5 years, accounted for 32% of global imports of weapons. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE were the main recipient countries. Syria, 7 years into its bloody civil war, only accounted for 1% of arms imports to the region. Egypt is getting on the fake news train just a couple weeks ahead of elections. The country's judiciary announced this week that it has set up a hotline to gather complaints of false news reports in traditional or online media that could, quote, pose a threat to national security. Last week, Egypt's government press center called for a boycott of the BBC over a report on human rights it said was false. Uber Eats, the Uber-owned food delivery service, will expand to over 100 cities, including in the Middle East. So far, they've listed Egypt as an upcoming market, but the company didn't mention specific cities as of yet, and has yet to release its full expansion list. Presently, Uber Eats operates in 200 cities around the globe, including some locations where Uber's primary ride-hailing service has yet to launch. More than 1,500 medical students and interns protested this week in Tunis in front of the National Health Ministry. They're standing against a legislative reform that pushes back the delivery of a diploma by several years. And in general, they're demanding greater rights for medical interns. The reform also prevents students from learning skills they require in order to work abroad. Protesters held signs that read, "Patients are in danger." And that's it. There's a lot going on in the Middle East, but don't worry, we'll keep an eye on it for you. See you next time.
It's been exactly 1 month since the Florida school shooting that claimed the lives of 17 students and teachers. And on this day, hundreds of thousands of students across the United States staged a walkout and showed their solidarity.
The students also came out in full force to protest Congress's inaction against the gun violence that continues to plague schools. I-24 News correspondent Marcus White has the details.
From coast to coast, students walked out of class pushing for change. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School student David Hogg live streamed the walkout at his school, which is still grieving from the tragedy.
We're walking out of school because how can we be expected to do our jobs as students and learn if our politicians won't?
Schools across the country allowed the walkouts, but others threatened discipline for leaving class. Thousands of students gathered in front of the White House with a message for President Trump. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo was spotted at a demonstration in New York City. And at exactly 10 a.m., students from Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis High School in Manhattan walked out with their fellow teen activists from around the country.
Enough.
And then
we are going to have 17 minutes of silence to represent each life that was taken away too soon. These victims are Lisa Al-Hadef, 14 years old.
They stood in silence after reading the names of each of the victims of the massacre in Florida. There were nearly 200 students at this protest. Most of them had the same reason to walk out.
We're in great danger. We're in risk of being shot.
Me going to school, it's just sad that I have to be scared for my life. I come to school to get an education, and that I have to have a fear for my friends, my classmates, my own family of getting hurt.
Students say after the latest school shooting, they learned a lesson no student should ever have to learn.
It really hit close to home for us that we can wake up one day and not see our parents again.
Many wore orange buttons, hoping to show their stance against gun violence. Adults held a protest across the street and shared a message of their own to New Yorkers who walked by. And students shared a message to their fellow classmates.
Make yourself aware of your district's representative.
Our duty as the next generation, we are rising up and our voice needs to be heard.
Right, 24 News correspondent Marcus White, who did that story, joins us now in studio. Marcus, what was the overall mood at the event that you attended?
So these students didn't have fear, they weren't angry, but they really just wanted to appear to be passionate about a message, and they just say that something needs to be done about gun control and now.
And we understand that some of the schools that participated in this walkout across the country are schools that actually experienced gun violence, gun shooting.
So, in fact, Columbine High School, who had the shooting back in 1999, it's so interesting to feel that it's been so long ago since that happened, where a number of people were killed. They had their own walkout there, where, of course, a number of people were there. They read the names of the victims of those who died in the Florida shooting, as well as the name of the victims of those who were shot and killed in Columbine. 12 students and a teacher killed then back in 1999. Also in Connecticut, there were a number of walkouts there, and a lot of the walkouts, of course, people were thinking about Sandy Hook, which just is still dealing with recovering from the tragedy there, which happened back in 2012, where 20 students were killed and 6 adult staff members.
There was on this day, and at least in the U.S. House, they passed a measure that would essentially tighten background checks and provide some training and money for teachers, but it did not include a ban on bump stocks or a ban on assault weapons or closing the gun show loophole or raising the age from 18 to 21. How closely are the students following the legislation, and what specifically are they looking for?
So at a lot of these events, students really didn't seem to get into too many specifics. It seems like they just want action. They say that, you know, it's been so long since action has been taken. They look back at a lot of these school shootings that have happened, and it's really this movement that is kind of taking place that's allowing them to say that really enough is enough, and they think that they have to be the generation for change, considering what happened in Florida.
But today was just a regular school day, right? And some schools, as you mentioned in this piece, were threatening with discipline if students walk out?
Indeed. In fact, there was a school in New Jersey which threatened to suspend students who participated in the walkout at 10 a.m. So this was something that was planned. So a lot of people got social media messages that this was planned at 10 a.m. Their local time. And this one student in New Jersey happened to walk out at 10 a.m. after hearing that her school was going to threaten suspension and decided to go ahead with it anyway. It's unclear what action that she's facing, but a lot of these schools threatened that students would have at least in-school suspensions. Some schools weren't specific, but some of these schools, I think, did have some security concerns in mind when they made these threats, because you think about it, a number of students walking out, if there's no area on campus for this to happen, and then, of course, everybody would know where students are at one time, so I'm sure that many campuses did have security concerns.
We have a map of all of the schools across the United States where there were walkouts on this day, and you can see literally, 25 different states, every major city. How did the students coordinate this? Was it mostly through social media?
So there's a group called Empower that organized this, and they're the youth branch of the Women's March Network. The Women's March Network has done a number of marches against Donald Trump and some women's marches recently. So they're the ones that have kind of coordinated this effort. Once word gets out online, of course, young people probably found out about it sooner than us in the media found out about it, and they signed up in these various different cities. And in fact, there's another march against gun violence planned in the coming weeks.
Yeah, in Washington, D.C.
24th, right?
24th, and that one will be.
Marcus White, thank you so much for this report. And as students, teachers, and adults across the U.S. continue to lobby for changes to gun control laws, we look abroad at other nations' policies on this issue.
A lot of people in the U.S. debate have made the comparison with Israel, where there are a lot of people, 350,000 people who own firearms. And yes, there are some similarities, but there are also some differences. Our correspondent Ariel Evan Waldman takes a closer look.
In Israel, a gun strapped to somebody's hip is a very common sight. Soldiers, security personnel, and yes, even civilians. So much so that roughly 2% of Israeli civilians have personal firearms, according to government data, and an equal number own firearms as security guards. And this in turn has caused many Americans, including the firearms lobby, to compare the two countries. But there are enormous differences. The key difference is that in Israel, owning a firearm is a privilege, not a right. And that's a privilege the government very jealously guards.
Not every person in Israel has the right to carry a firearm. The government decides to give this privilege to people only if they live in a dangerous area according to what the government thinks, or in their work they need a firearm, or they served in a very special unit in the Israeli army, and there are a little bit more criteria.
So what are these criteria? A firearms applicant must work in the security sector, and if they don't, the restrictions are rather tight. They must be 21 years old if they have served in the Army, or 27 if they did not. They must have lived in the country for a minimum of 3 years. A clean criminal record is needed, as well as a clean bill of health and mental health signed by a doctor. They must also live or work in what the ministry deems a dangerous area, conflict zones, settlement blocks, or anything over the green line. But perhaps the biggest difference, though, is cultural attitudes towards firearms.
It is these civilians who have been properly armed who have acted as first responders in many, many cases. And that's sort of become a little bit of the aha moment in at least the last year or two, where the ministries involved, and as well as the police, etc., they sort of said, you know what, maybe we should start allowing more people to carry a gun.
In Israel, with its near universal military conscription, firearms is seen as a necessary emergency tool. In the past 10 years, civilians with firearms have stopped around 50 terror attacks, according to data from Bar-Ilan University. But in America, it's a universal right and has a huge sporting culture built around it, but very limited federal control. And while states and even cities maintain their own laws, some of which can be even more restrictive than Israel's, it's very hard to draw any real comparison between the two countries. Ariel Evan Waldman, I-24 News.
It is very hard to compare, David, between Israel and the United States when it comes to gun laws, but I can tell you that even in Israel, we are hearing certain voices, even from inside the parliament, but there are very few calling for more liberties when it comes to guns. Especially we heard these voices during the knife intifada.
Right. I think the issue that so many Americans would have is that in a place like Israel, it's not as if there's a gun show and anybody can go to a gun show and buy a weapon. They still have to go through all those criteria that Ariel Evan Waldman listed in the case.
Exactly. And, you know, the majority of the population does serve the IDF, so.
Still ahead, we will remember the great Stephen Hawking, the world-renowned physicist who acted as an emblem of human determination and curiosity. He was a world-renowned and visionary physicist whose incredible discoveries changed the way all of us think about the universe.
Stephen Hawking's story of resilience and passion inspired so many. He passed away on Wednesday at the age of 76. Molly Hunter takes a look back at his remarkable life.
It has been a glorious time to be alive.
He pushed the boundaries of science and his own life, far outliving doctors' predictions that he would die years ago.
I was told it would kill me in 2 or 3 years.
He battled and thrived with ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, for 5 decades. He married twice and had 3 children. ABC's Diane Sawyer spoke with him back in 2010.
What is the best fatherly advice that you give them?
1. Remember to look up at the stars and not down at your feet.
And his research on black holes and relativity made him a star, one of the brightest of his generation.
Physics may explain the mysteries of the universe.
His best-selling book made him a celebrity, and his humor made him a cult figure of sorts.
Does that mean that there is a universe out there where I am smarter than you?
Yes, and also a universe where you're funny.
In short, he made science cool. He even featured in The Simpsons and played himself in The Big Bang Theory.
It's an honor and a privilege to meet you, sir.
I know.
What if I reverse time?
And Eddie Redmayne, who won an Oscar for starring as Hawking in the film The Theory of Everything, said, "We have lost a truly beautiful mind, the funniest man I have ever had the pleasure to meet." And for a man who accomplished so much, there was still so much more he had wanted to do.
I could have gone on and on. Space, here I come.
And that was Molly Hunter reporting. Tal, we have just enough time on this show to end it in a lighter note before we have to let it go. Not bad, right? So anyway, there was this guy who dressed up as Elsa, Queen Elsa from the kids' movie Frozen. There he is in Boston, and he spotted this police paddy wagon from a bar, and he got out, hiked over his dress, and helped push the paddy wagon out of the snow. What do you think of it?
That's a true Disney heroine over there. I don't know how to call it.
Yeah, he's...
But he wasn't singing while doing that.
He wasn't singing, but he was being the queen that he always meant to be. And doing all the good things that a girl should be, or however that
I appreciate this outfit. And now we have to let it go, as David said. That does it for this hour of Crossroads.
Stay with us on 924 News for much more. We'll be right back.